I go up to him and I said, Jack, maybe, and he says, Rob, you don't understand. I love to act.
Some movies give you a courtroom battle. This one gives you a 2-hour interrogation of what honor actually means, then settles the whole argument in a single outburst from a man who never wanted to take the stand in the first place. That movie is A Few Good Men, released in 1992 under the direction of Rob Reiner. On the surface, it's a legal drama about a court-martial at Guantanamo Bay. Underneath, it's a story about a Navy lawyer who spent his short career settling cases instead of trying them, and the one case he finally can't talk his way out of. Tom Cruise plays Lieutenant Daniel Coffey, the reluctant hotshot behind the wheel. Jack Nicholson plays Colonel Nathan Jessup, a man who wears the word duty like armor. Demi Moore is Lieutenant Commander Joan Galloway, the one person in the film who actually reads the paperwork before showing up. Kevin Bacon plays the prosecutor forced to watch his own case fall apart in real time, and Kiefer Sutherland plays a young officer who has spent his whole life waiting for permission to follow orders without asking why. Today we're counting down 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally tragic facts about how this film came together. And stick with us to the end, because the true story that inspired the movie has a final chapter the film never touched. One that involves a Marine who vanished from his own driveway in 1994 and was never seen alive again. Let's get into it. Before he was one of the most recognizable screenwriters in Hollywood, Aaron Sorkin was trying to make it as an actor in New York, and mostly failing. He handed out flyers dressed as a giant moose in Times Square, sang telegrams for spare cash, and tended bar most nights at a Broadway theater during a long-running hit show. The job had a strange rhythm. A rush of drink orders right before curtain, another rush at intermission, and then long stretches of near-total silence while the first act played out on stage above him. Sorkin used that dead time to write. He didn't have a notebook handy most nights, so he scribbled dialogue and scene ideas on cocktail napkins, stuffed them in his pocket, and typed them up later on a second-hand computer his roommates had all pitched in to buy. The inspiration for the story came from an ordinary phone call with his sister, who was a Navy lawyer preparing to travel to Guantanamo Bay to defend a group of Marines accused in a hazing-related case. That single conversation became the seed for an entire courtroom drama. Sorkin spent roughly a year and a half turning napkin scraps into a finished script, and a chance encounter eventually put it in front of a producer who had been searching for exactly this kind of story. He sold the rights before the play had even opened, and years later the finished film would go on to earn well over $200 million worldwide. Not a bad return for scenes written a few feet from a bar tab. Kevin Pollak plays Lieutenant Sam Weinberg, the dry-witted third member of the defense team, and he's become inseparable from the role. But he wasn't the first actor offered the part. Rob Reiner originally wanted a different comedic actor who was, at the time, busy shooting a brand-new NBC sitcom that nobody expected to last very long. Production planned around the assumption that the show would get canceled and free the actor up in time. Instead, the network renewed it, the actor's schedule stayed locked, and the role went to Pollak instead, who brought exactly the deadpan energy the film needed. The sitcom in question turned into one of the most successful comedies in television history, running for 9 seasons and ending with the finale watched by tens of millions of people. It was a spectacular bet to win, even if it meant missing out on sharing scenes with Jack Nicholson. Demi Moore auditioned for the role of Lieutenant Commander Joan Galloway while roughly 8 months pregnant, competing against a long list of well-known actresses for the part. What drew her to the role wasn't the paycheck. It was the fact that the character existed almost entirely outside of romance, as a lawyer who is simply good at her job and treated as such by the men around her. She wanted the part badly enough that she voluntarily lowered her own asking price by a significant margin, at a point in her career when she genuinely needed a hit. There was resistance behind the scenes, too. At one stage, a studio executive reportedly questioned why the character needed to be written as a woman at all if there wasn't going to be a romantic storyline attached to her. Sorkin later called that note one of the most discouraging moments of his career, while Moore saw it differently. To her, that exact objection was proof the role mattered. She gave birth, trained to get back into physical shape for the shoot, and returned to set to finish the film. When it became a massive box office success, the studio arranged a private flight for her to attend the New York premiere. As the story goes, she looked at the jet and simply asked for a second one, for the luggage. Wolfgang Bodison wasn't hired to act in A Few Good Men. His job was to find filming locations, negotiate access with property owners, and handle the unglamorous logistics that make a production possible. He'd studied fine arts in college, moved to Los Angeles hoping to write and direct, and worked his way up through a production company's mailroom before becoming Reiner's assistant on an earlier film. When Reiner struggled to cast the role of a Marine Lance Corporal on trial alongside Coffey's client, he turned to Bodison, who had never acted a day in his life and had never even considered it. Reiner asked him to audition anyway. Bodison hired an acting coach for the first time, walked into the room without a headshot or resume, and landed the part days later while he was still out scouting locations for the very same film. He went from negotiating permit fees to sharing scenes with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and critics took notice. His performance earned him an award nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actor. Not a bad outcome for someone whose original assignment was booking a parking lot. The United States Marine Corps refused to officially support the production. Military reviewers who read the script saw a story where Navy lawyers exposed wrongdoing the Corps hadn't rooted out on its own, and they weren't interested in helping tell it. That refusal meant no access to a real Marine base and no official military cooperation of any kind. Reiner was reportedly asked to change the defense attorneys from Navy officers into Marines to soften the portrayal. He declined, so the production shot its Guantanamo Bay stand-in at a naval air station in California instead. And in a strange twist, roughly 200 off-duty Marines still showed up to work as paid extras, appearing in uniform in a film their own branch had refused to endorse. Even the title carries a bit of irony. A Few Good Men had been part of Marine recruiting language for decades before it ever became a Courtroom tagline. Reiner quietly brought in another accomplished screenwriter to help sharpen the script, a writer whose name never appeared anywhere in the credits, but whose fingerprints are all over the film's most famous moment. In Sorkin's original stage version, the case was resolved through physical evidence, a falsified document that proved Colonel Jessup had lied. Reiner didn't want the ending to hinge on paperwork. He wanted it to hinge on a man losing his composure under pressure. So the document was cut, and the climax became a psychological duel instead, Coffey walking into the courtroom with nothing but a hunch and Jessup's own arrogance to work with. Sorkin was impressed enough by the change that he went back and rewrote his stage play to match the film's version. Every theater production of A Few Good Men performed today uses that reshaped ending, and the writer who helped create it still receives no formal credit for it. Jack Nicholson's total screen time in the film adds up to roughly 20 minutes across 3 scenes, and the studio reportedly paid him somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 million for it, a rate per shooting day that would translate to well over $10 million today. When filming ran slightly behind schedule, Nicholson came back for an extra, unpaid morning to finish his remaining footage, later remarking that a studio doesn't pay that kind of money to someone who hasn't earned it. During the filming of his big courtroom monologue, Nicholson reportedly delivered the speech at full intensity, not just for his own coverage, but again and again for the reaction shots of every other actor in the scene. Reiner eventually suggested he might want to save some energy for his own close-up. Nicholson's answer was simple. He loved acting, and when the camera finally turned to him, he delivered the exact same performance all over again. Word spread quickly around the production that Nicholson was about to film his biggest monologue, and the supposedly closed set stopped being closed. Crews later described looking up mid-scene to find the rafters packed with crew members from other productions and studio staff who had heard what was happening and wandered over to watch. Pollak had a front-row seat off camera, as did his visiting mother, who, according to the story he's told for years, spent the afternoon more interested in flirting with Nicholson than in watching the performance itself. Sutherland has told his own version of that day. Nicholson ran through the entire speech once, delivered it so well the room went completely silent, and Reiner quietly asked if he wanted to try it again. Nicholson agreed, delivered a second take just as strong as the first, and Reiner, who had planned to shoot the scene across an entire day, simply sent everyone home. He knew he already had what he needed. Off-camera, Nicholson had a reputation for being an unpredictable, playful presence between setups, the opposite of his composed, coiled energy on film. During the tense courtroom standoff between Coffey and Jessup, Nicholson reportedly spent much of the scene, while just out of frame, making faces and doing everything he could to break Cruise's concentration without actually stepping into the shot. Cruise held his focus and finished the take. Afterward, he walked over and gave Nicholson a solid punch to the shoulder. Not out of frustration, but as a kind of physical thank you for weeks of being kept on his toes. By all accounts, Nicholson loved it. In December of 1992, Nicholson had two films arriving in theaters within weeks of each other: A Few Good Men and a separate drama in which he starred for a longtime friend and director. The studio behind A Few Good Men moved its release date earlier, which meant it had a full 2 weeks in theaters before the second film even opened. Trade press at the time noted that the timing looked deliberate, positioning one Nicholson performance to dominate audience attention before the other could find its footing. Nicholson was reportedly unhappy about it, given how much the second project meant to him personally. In the end, the numbers made the outcome clear. A Few Good Men opened at number 1, held the top spot for 3 consecutive weeks, and went on to earn well over $200 million worldwide. The other film struggled to find an audience and never recovered its budget. Before Nicholson was cast, the role of Colonel Jessup had been offered around to several major actors, all of whom passed for various reasons. One of them had already committed to another project, a Western directed by and starring Clint Eastwood, in which he would play a sheriff. Nicholson stepped into the role of Jessup instead and turned it into one of the most memorable supporting performances of his career, earning him an Oscar nomination. At that year's Academy Awards, the Best Supporting Actor trophy went to the very actor who had turned down Jessup in favor of that Eastwood Western. And it wasn't an isolated moment. A Few Good Men and that Western competed head-to-head in 3 major categories that night, and the Western swept all 3. There's a quiet scene where Coffey is simply reviewing testimony with his co-counsel, walking through inconsistencies in Jessup's account. Nothing about the moment called for anything flashy, but during filming, Cruise reportedly broke into an unannounced, spot-on impression of Nicholson's voice and mannerisms while reading the Colonel's own words back. Despite Nicholson not even being in the scene, nobody had been warned it was coming. The genuine, surprised reactions from his co-stars in that moment were left in the finished film, giving audiences an unplanned laugh buried inside a serious procedural scene. Sorkin has built an entire career on treating dialogue as something precisely engineered, nothing wasted, nothing accidental. Yet the single most famous line in the entire film wasn't quite what he originally wrote. In Sorkin's script, Jessup's response to being pushed for the truth was simply, "You already have the truth." A quieter, more clinical concession that fit the character's controlled arrogance. What ended up on screen was different. Nicholson delivered the now iconic 5 words that turned a courtroom admission into something closer to a philosophy. A declaration that ordinary people can't handle what men like him have to do to keep them safe. That version of the line was powerful enough that Sorkin revised his own stage play afterward to include it, meaning every theatrical production staged today uses the film's version of the moment rather than the original script. The line has since appeared on lists of the greatest movie quotes of all time and has been referenced everywhere from political debates to real courtroom proceedings. Years before Cruise and Nicholson stepped into their roles, the stage version of A Few Good Men had its own original cast. The actor who originated Lieutenant Coffey on Broadway had previously earned an Oscar nomination for playing Mozart in a period drama, losing that award to the actor who played his rival within the same film. The actor who originated Colonel Jessup on stage would go on, decades later, to play one of the most recognizable villains in modern blockbuster history. Both actors built these characters from scratch in front of live theater audiences during a production that ran well over a year. When the film adaptation came together, neither of them was cast in the movie version of the roles they created. One drifted toward producing, and the other continued building a long career playing screen villains. Neither name appears anywhere in the film's credits, even though the performances that shaped these now iconic characters started with them. For the film to work as a courtroom drama, it needed a death, a murder charge, a court-martial, a reason for Jessup to take the stand. So Sorkin created a fictional victim, loosely inspired by a real Marine involved in an actual 1986 hazing incident at Guantanamo Bay. In real life, That Marine survived the assault and recovered. Sorkin transformed survival into fatality because the story needed higher stakes. What the film never shows is what happened afterward to the real Marines involved. One of them, convicted of a lesser offense connected to the incident, served his sentence, was honorably discharged, and returned home to an ordinary life in Massachusetts, working a part-time job while waiting on a permanent position. When the film became a hit, he recognized pieces of his own story on screen and wasn't happy about it. He spoke to reporters and eventually joined other Marines in a lawsuit against the studio, arguing the story had drawn directly from real events without permission. The studio denied the claims. Then, one morning in January of 1994, he left his house and never returned. His truck was found in the driveway with the keys still inside and an uncashed paycheck on the dashboard. The only thing missing was a Marine Corps jacket he rarely wore. Months later, his body was discovered along a riverbank. Investigators determined he had been shot and ruled out robbery since his wallet and cash were untouched. No suspects were ever identified, and no connection to the lawsuit, the incident, or the film was ever proven. The case remains unsolved to this day, which means the strangest, darkest chapter connected to a few good men is one that never made it anywhere near the script. And that's the story behind one of the most quoted courtroom dramas ever made. Napkin drafts, boycotting Marines, an uncredited rewrite, a $5 million monologue, and a real-life mystery the film never touched. Which of these caught you most off guard? Let us know. And if you know someone who still does the Nicholson voice every time they think they're winning an argument, send this their way.